speakers from, people attending from all over the globe with different hours. I'm Vittorio Gallese, and it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce today's speaker, who is also our host, Professor Claudio Paolucci. Claudio Paolucci is professor of semiotics at the University of Bologna, Italy, where he's the coordinator of the PhD program in philosophy, science, cognition, and semiotics. He is the scientific coordinator of the International Center for Humanities, Umberto Eco, and the PI of 2 European projects on embodied interactions and fake news. His last book, which is just out, is Cognitive Semiotics, Integrating Science, Minds, Meanings, and Cognition, published by Springer a few days ago. Claudio is not only internationally renowned, but is also a good friend and probably the last or one of the last pupils of Umberto Eco. The title of his talk is Cognitive Semiotics, Sense-Making and Enactivism. Claudio, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Vittorio, and thanks everybody for being here. It's a pleasure and an honor. I see a lot of people, so I'm very happy. It also means that our international center is working fine. So you may have recognized that we choose a platypus in the logo of the international center. You may have also seen that a book on cognitive semiotics, as Vittorio was telling, has been published this week by Springer, and the two things are not without correlations. Indeed, in 1997, Umberto Eco wrote a book called Kant and the Platypus, that is, together with Meaning and Experience by Patrizia Violi, in my opinion, the very foundation of the cognitive semiotics. In my view, cognitive semiotics should not be conceived as a special type of semiotics, but as an attempt to answer the question how we come to know the world through science and languages. I'm inspiring this exactly by Umberto Eco and by his ideas on semiotics that we can read. I think the theme I have addressed in an almost obsessive way throughout all of my work is that of how we come to know the world. Perhaps this explains the growing attention I have dedicated to narrative universes. These constitute an ersatz, a substitute for the word. I do not want to be the critic of or the reviewer of myself, but think of my novels. The issue in The Name of the Rose is a truth to uncover. Foucault's pendulum discusses how to construct a non-existent word. The eyeline of The Day Before examines a world that exists, but the contours of which are still unclear. My interest in avant-garde phenomena springs from the interest for a language that tends to break down and recreate our worldview. My work in semiotics, in the end, concerns the problem of how our signs give account of that which is, or construct that which is not. As you see, semiotics, in the very end, concerns the problem of how our signs give account of that which is, or constructs that which is not. This is why Umberto Eco used to tell that semiotics is in principle the discipline studying everything which can be used in order to lie. I think that the definition of the theory of the lie should be taken as a pretty comprehensive program for general semiotics. I think Umberto is wrong is defining semiotics as a theory of the lie, since lying means to tell voluntarily something that is not the case. For instance, when Ptolemy was telling us that the Earth stands still in the middle of the universe, he was not lying, he was wrong. So we need to transpose Eco's definitions from the idea of sign to the idea of semiotic system. If there is a semiotics, if there is a system that makes lying possible, then that system is a semiotic system. This is my idea. You have a semiotic system if that system allows deception. This obviously does not necessarily entail that the system is cultural or socially established. For instance, James Lloyd studied the case of firefly femme fatale, specialized in mimicking the mating signals of other species of fireflies, with the purpose of attracting responding males to become their prey. These aggressive acts of mimicry are a major factor in the survival and reproduction of both prey and predator. It is a case of deception through active falsification of information that leads to efficient predation by femme fatale fireflies and trigger evolutionary processes in their prey's communicative behaviors. So the firefly brings forth a word through meaning, and does that through the construction of a significant surface capable of lying, that is the mating signal, sensitively adjusting in characteristic ways to the particularities of their situated circumstances. The firefly attunes to the image of the other in order to trick him, to cheat him, and does that on the tendency actually to behave in a similar way under similar circumstances in the future. That is, she does that based on habits. So I think that this is a crucial point for our International Center, because depending on how the idea of habit is interpreted, you may have the radical enactivist view by Donato that grounds habits on the enactivist idea of adaptivity, or you can have maybe Vittorio Gallese's view of the embodied simulation. You can easily interpret the mating signal as an embodied representation. I don't go deep on that because we have scheduled 2 interventions on this topic, the one by Vittorio in May and the one by Fausto Caruana in June. I simply want to tell you what is my way, which is the cognitive semiotic way to interpret habits. This is the classic one, pragmatism. To develop the meaning of something, we have therefore simply to determine what habits it produces. For what a thing means is simply what habits it involves. Now, the identity of a habit depends on how it might lead us to act, not merely under such circumstances as are likely to arise, but under such as might possibly occur, no matter how improbable they may be. What the habit is depends on when and how it causes us to act. Thus, we come down to what is tangible and conceivably practical as the root of every real distinction of thought, no matter how subtle it may be. And there is no distinction of meaning so fine as to consist in anything but the possible difference of practice. Thought is an action, and that it consists in a relation. So what is the core business of the classic way? It's a kind of double identification. First, the identification of meaning with the habit, and not with truth condition like in analytical philosophy. I'll come back on that. And the second identification is the identification of the couple, meaning habit with cognition. Because meaning is not thought as content representing the word as being a certain way, but as habit. And cognition does not serve to represent the word, but to effectively act in it. Of course, to act in the word, it is necessary sometimes to represent it. But in order to act in the word in an effective way, it is necessary first and foremost to bring forth words through meaning, like the firefly does with her mating signal. And meanings are not representation of the word, but habits, tendency actually to behave in a similar way under similar circumstances in the future. If we move like that, the connection between semiotics and enactivism is quite natural. Even more if we come back to the idea of the system. A semiotic system is a system that enables deception. Languages and living systems, but I would say also artificial intelligence systems, think about the Turing tests, are such systems. Indeed, on the one hand, linguistics, Saussure and Yamsler, for example, used to think that languages had to be thought existent. It was the revolution of linguistics of the last century. On the other hand, enactivism assumes that cognition is the result of the interactive relations that occur between an organism and the environment in which it is situated. However, neither the organism nor the environment is the main actor of this idea of cognition. It is the system of the two that makes cognition possible. It is not by chance that in his last years, Francisco Varela was working at the CREA in Paris together with Jean Petitot, who was working exactly on semiotics and on dynamical system theory connected to it. Exactly as it was for languages according to Saussure and to Yamsler, for the enactivist, it is only the system that matters for cognition. Indeed, one of the main theses of enactivism is that the living organism, in order to survive, has to build its internal autonomy and create a distinction between itself and the environment in which it is embedded. To exist, this distinction needs a continuous and precarious engagement between the organism and the environment called structural coupling. From the starting point of the structural coupling between organism and environment, a subset of the myriad forms of coupling with the environment that constitutes the organism's world, that is, those engagements that are appreciated as meaningful by the organism, emerge. Nothing occurs in this world that is not significant and in relation to which the organism positions itself, even in the particular case of indifference, which is also a position. So as you know very well, in his last works, Francisco Varela called this relationship sense-making, thus identifying its semiotic structure from its name onwards. However, there is much more semiotics in sense-making than the name alone. To use Yamsler's terminology, sense-making is the process involving the cutting of a pre-semiotic continuum which, from the starting point of n possible relationships, selects the most relevant based on a system of meaning understood as a system of values. It is via sense-making operation that the word becomes a meaningful word connected to the organism's position in the systems. Sense-making is the capacity of an autonomous system to adaptively regulate its operation and its relation to the environment depending on the virtual consequences for its own viability as a form of life. Being a sense-maker implies an ongoing, often imperfect and variable tuning to the world and a readiness for action. Sense-making lies at the core of every form of action, perception, emotion, and cognition. This is constitutively what distinguishes mental life from other material and relational processes. So we are adding another important piece to our cognitive semiotics. Cognition is sense-making. Enactivism assumes that cognition is the result of the interactive relations that occur between an organism and the environment in which it's situated. However, as John Gallagher has shown us, this environment is not a natural one, but is a social environment built on intersubjectivity, crowded with objects, norms, habits, institutions, and artifacts that shapes our minds. An idea which is extremely interesting for semiotics is that sense-making is not an activity which resides within the organism or the subject. Quite the contrary, sense-making is an activity which emanates from the system. Enactivism does not supply us with the idea of a subject which binds up the real into categories, or of an organism structurally coupled with this environment which adds its own meaning or its own series of meanings to this world and this environment. Quite the contrary. Sense-making is an adding subtraction, the addition of subtraction activity, which carves out its own subset of relevant interactions from within a dynamic coupling between organism and environment, which have value for the system and the organisms themselves. In brief, sense-making is the activity of adding subtractions, which carves out a world of values and meaning, I would say an environmental world, from the starting point of many other possible environments and worlds. In my recent book, Persona, and also in the second chapter of my Cognitive Semiotics, I conceived precisely of this adding subtractions activity as the act of enunciation, which is the semiolinguistic equivalent of the sense-making process. I go a little bit deeper on that, because I believe this is a key idea for a cognitive semiotics connected to enactivism, since it enables certain ideas from the semiolinguistic tradition to be amended. The starting point of the sense-making situation is not that of an absence of meaning, absence of sounds, the idea of monk by Grémas for all the semioticians who are here with us. So the idea of monk is a kind of deficit of meaning which pushes us in the direction of a series of narrative transformations. Grémas and Ricoeur. Quite the contrary. There is always too much sense. And the problem is filtering it and constructing a semiotic niche capable of allowing for a wall of productive interaction. Let's clarify this point. Ecological niche refers to the environment occupied by a species or population within its habitat. It is understood not as a physical space, but as the ensemble of the roles and function which individuals take on in an ecosystem, using, modifying, and building the resources of the habitat itself. Languages, but also norms, institutions, and uses of the speakers are especially complex semiotic niches, which have prone possibilities and ecologically built semiotic environments which regulate in a certain way, and not in other ways, the interaction with the subject inhabiting them. Within diverse languages, institutions, and norms, we find diverse forms of regulations of interactions, which are the effect of different adding of subtractions. Sense-making does not add anything to the rich coupling with the environment. It subtracts from it by monitoring and responding to only a small and relevant subset of all the influences that impinge on the organism, a subset out of which the organism constitutes itself as a sense maker. It is precisely in this way that the enactivist idea of agency as an addition of subtractions from semiotic niches, from systems, norms, uses, collective appreciation, etc., is connected to what semioticians call the theory of enunciation, and especially precisely to the idea of the act of enunciation. Consider the production of art as an example, an act of sense-making which is a long way away from the life science domain and doubly bound up with the logics of culture, as artistic enunciation has frequently been conceived of as centered on the subject, on its creative individuality of words and producer of reality. However, for an artist, a canvas is never empty. For a writer, a page is never blank. Both canvas and page are always too full of the already said, the already painted, the cliché, the stereotypes, the interpretative habits, that is of the wall of schemes, norms, habits, and usages which regulate a system's discursive formation. As Louis Jensler used to show, every subjective act of enunciation depends on a wall of virtual structure, which are perfectly real in their virtuality, which regulate utterance and enunciate production. When artists such as Cézanne or Francis Bacon say that the problem for painterly enunciation is avoiding cliches, they are saying so because enunciation, filling up a canvas or a page, is always bound up with stereotypes, norms, habits, and usages which define the very moment they find themselves in. It is precisely to the extent that it is empty that a canvas is always too full, overflowing with things already said precisely in its emptiness. But if this is true, what are these stereotypes, these cliches, these things already said, which a blank page is so replete with, precisely in its being blank? In semiotics and the philosophy of language, Umberto Eco used the term encyclopedia to refer to the wall of the already said, the library of the libraries, the recorded said of all the interpretation. For Eco, the encyclopedia is a semiotic environmental word representing the background to our perception of the world and our sense-making activities. Indeed, each sense-making activity generates meaning from the starting point of this virtual background of the already said, which traces and records all the enunciates already enunciated. As such, encyclopedia does pertain to the Yevslevian dimension of usage, namely the semiotic dimension in which each individual act pulsates with its relationship with other individual acts, the dimension of intersubjectivity in some way. At the same time, an encyclopedia is the production, is simultaneously a set of virtual scheme, of virtual norms, which represent the condition of possibility of the production of new enunciates. Indeed, each culture retains a memory of its various linguistic and non-linguistic uses, regulating this in accordance with collective appreciations, and thus bringing forth relational schemas which prune down the system possibilities. For Eco, the encyclopedia is the potential for new sense-making production. Attempting to reactivate a concept which, in Eco's work, is almost always a theoretical notion, not sufficiently put to concrete empirical test, I would argue that we can speak of the encyclopedia as an a priori effect. I mean that the encyclopedia is an effect to the extent that it is the product of all the acts of enunciation it records. But it is a priori, which is a material a priori, an historical a priori, to the extent that it locally represents the condition of possibility for new acts of enunciation. An encyclopedia is simultaneously structured by past enunciation in structuring of future enunciation. Thus, it is not precisely the encyclopedia which fills up the writer's pages prior to his enunciation and obliges the artist to take away by addition of subtractions. It is not the encyclopedia, the set of schemes, of norms and uses which an artist's empty canvas is so replete with in its emptiness. When Francis Bacon argues that the whole preparatory work prior to painting needs to be done in order to free it of cliché, and that a painting must always pass through a series of involuntary acts, such as throwing color on a canvas, making marks which mean nothing, brushing apart, randomly rubbing out, etc. All this kind of involuntary acts. What it means is that a painter, the work of a painter is never filling up a blank surface, but rather emptying, clearing, cleaning off the canvas all those encyclopedic stereotypes it is so replete with. For this reason, the painting is already there, exactly as Michelangelo said he did with his block of marble. The canvas is already in all those encyclopedic stereotypes, in this virtuality of culture. So the artist must remove it, adding subtraction, no? Exactly as Michelangelo said, used to do with the block of marble. So when we move from linguistic to semiotics, abandoning Saussure's distinction between langue and parole, which is a vintage one, every act of enunciation which makes us pass from the encyclopedia to the enunciate is an addiction of subtraction, which enacts an encyclopedic virtual with its stereotypes, its cliché, and its overflowing already said. And this is also true when the act forcefully attempts to deviate from this set of schemes, norms, frames, uses and already enunciated enunciates, potentializing them, virtualizing them. An enunciation is always a singularity if compared to the schemes, the norms, the uses, and the enunciates which make it possible. However, enunciative events are not born in isolation. Quite the contrary, they emerge opposing to other equally possible events which could equally have emerged within that system. Every act of enunciation effectively negates and contradicts others which would have been equally possible. It is the very existence of the enunciate which negates and contradicts other enunciates. For this reason, in his Archaeology of Knowledge, which formulates an important theory of impersonal enunciation, Michel Foucault dealt simultaneously with the regularity of the enunciates, their dependence on a regular system of schemes, norms, and uses, and their rarity, the fact that all is never said. It's a quotation. However numerous they are, enunciates are always in deficit. Enunciates are studied at the limit which separates them from what is not said, within the instance which bring them out to the exclusion of all the others. For cognitive semiotics, regularity and rarity represent the two foundational principles of a semiotic agency capable of constructing semiotic niches. Objectively regulated and regular, without being the product of obedience to a system of rules by a subject, enunciates are at the same time rare, because their presence excludes the contemporary presence of other enunciates which would have been equally possible on the basis of the regularities of the system. This addiction of subtractions, which makes us pass from the encyclopedia to the enunciate via schemes, norms, and uses, is the semiotic agency linked to the act of enunciation. It tears out sense-making and the act of enunciation from the ownership of a subjective instance and consigns them to a structural coupling between the organism and the semiotic environment of the encyclopedia, in which the former generates the latter, which generates the former. This paves the way for material engagement theory, an explanatory path based on three interrelated working hypotheses. The hypothesis of extended mind, which explore the constitutive intertwining of cognition with material culture. The hypothesis of inactive signification, which explore the nature of the material sign not as a representational mechanism, but as a semiotic conflation and cohabitation through matter that enacts and brings forth the word. And finally, the hypothesis of material agency, which explores agency not as a human property, but as the emergent product of situated activities. Indeed, the agency of the semiotic act of sense-making does not belong to the human subject, but to a multiplicity of enunciated instances that enact and bring forth a word of meaning and habits that extend cognition in the structural coupling with the semiotic environment that shapes our minds. Meaning is the temporal, emergent property of material engagement, the ongoing blending between the mental and the physical. In the case of material science, we do not read meaningful symbols. We meaningfully engage meaningless symbols. Material science have no meaning in themselves. Talking about this material term in semiotics. They merely afford the possibility of meaning, as a door affords the possibility of being opened. In real life, to interpret a material sign, it is to become habituated with the interactive possibilities and consequences of its performance in context. Material signs do not represent, they enact, they do not stand for reality, they bring forth reality. Now an important remark. In recent years, the use of notion of sense-making has been criticized by Dan Hatto and Eric Min, since they rightly consider the use of the term sense, but also significance and meaning, a potential source of misunderstanding for enactivist ideas. Indeed, if meaning is thought in terms of analytic philosophy, as content connected to truth conditions, the misunderstanding is just around the corner, since it would lead us to think of the most fundamental cognitive operation, which is sense-making, as a particular kind of representation of the world. This is why Hatto and Min try to explain cognition through the concept of basic mind, without employing any kind of vocabulary connected to semantics. However, the very same problem disappears if we assume a semiotic idea of meaning, connected to habits and tied to pragmatism and to material engagement theory, as the one I'm trying to introduce here through cognitive semiotics. This is why sense-making seems to me a perfect word in order to explain the basic form of cognition related to basic minds and connect them to higher forms of cognitive skills related to problem solving, norms, and language in a synechistic way, in a continuous way. So in my opinion, this is also the direction to go in order to answer some criticism toward enactivism and its supposed, I don't believe in that, of course, but the supposed difficulties to give account of high-order forms of cognition. As far as this topic is concerned, I would say that high-order sense-making activities connected to social practices like enunciation, norms, institutions, are a sort, I would say, of acceptation or ritualization of sense-making forms connected to basic minds, in order to use a radical enactivist terminology. In his last works on habits, Vittorio Gallese used to think of habits as dispositions as connected to the notion of motor potentiality. Our brain body expresses the range of potential relations to the world that lead to the constitution of a relational self, shaping and delimiting the horizon of the world we inhabit. This does not require one to assume that symbol making is the late externalization of a previously existent inner symbolic thought, because it suggests that symbolic thought and symbolic making are the co-constructive outcome of the development of shared performative practice and habits. In brief, my hypothesis, Vittorio, of course, who is talking, is that through the repetition, combination, and memorization of particular shared behaviors and actions, and their mimetic ritualization, the social group infuses new cultural meanings into reused bodily performances. Ritualization, as understood by zoology, refers to the evolutionary process by which human actions or behaviors lose the original function, but are retained for their role in display or other forms of social interactions. But Vittorio will talk more about that in his talk scheduled in May, or maybe in the discussion, because we will have a talk by Vittorio on this topic. As far as sense-making is concerned, I would say that we do not lose it in some way. So sense-making and participatory sense-making simply coexist as semiotic practices. Summing up, go to my conclusion. I can indicate 3 principles grounding a cognitive semiotics and my idea of it that you can find, for instance, in my books. Radical enactivism, meaning is not thought as content representing the world as being a certain way. Pragmatism, meaning is habit. Material engagement theory, mind is extending. Sign is enacted, and agency is kind of material, non-human, and distributed agents. So 3 central claims as a conclusion. Cognitive semiotics understand cognition as an inactive, skillful activity that involves the ongoing interaction with the environment. But this environment is not a natural one, but a semiotic environment crowded with objects, norms, habits, institutions, and artifacts that shapes our minds. So it's kind of grounded on intersubjectivity, on action and interaction, as Sean would tell. Second point, since cognition brings forth a word through meaning, like the femme fatale, and since being our habits, cognition is a sense-making activity that cuts a semiotic environment in order to act in the world in an effective way. Third point, sense-making is an addiction of subtractions activity whose agency does not belong to a subject, to the subject that represents the world, but it is distributed across a multiplicity of enunciatic instances. So when I was in Paris in 2003 to work at the CREA with Jean Petitot, who has been one of my true mentors, Francisco Varela, who also worked at the CREA with Jean Petitot, just passed away. And Jean was a semiotician and had worked a lot with both Greimas and Umberto Eco, was working at the time with Francisco on the book Naturalizing Phenomenology. It is a book they edited together. Jean Petitot, who loved Francisco, and you could see from every sentence he said when he talked about him, the love that he had for the work of Varela. And Jean knew that I was a semiotician and told me, Claudio, enactivism is the attempt to think about cognition in a non-representational way. But semiotics is intrinsically representationalist, so they cannot be together. I have thought about this idea by Jean Petitot for 20 years, and I hope that maybe not what I have said today, but at last my cognitive semiotics book just published can show that yes, semiotics and enactivism can be together, and they have to be together. It is exactly for that reason that we have built an international center for enactivism and cognitive semiotics. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Claudio, for this very intense and incredibly rich talk, which is now open to discussion. I hope we have a very hot and lively discussion with many issues that probably will raise a lot of discussion. Please turn off your mic, otherwise we have a loop effect. And the first question is Meneghelli, who was the quickest to raise his hand. Please.
Thank you. Hi to all. Good evening, afternoon, morning, all over the world. Thank you very much for the wonderful conference and talk by Claudio Paolucci. I hear some feedback, sound feedback. Okay, not now, no more. I appreciate also the conclusion. We can say about the conclusion that cognitivism could, cognitive semiotics could have a marriage with non-cognitive semiotics, semiotic without cognition. I think, as Kant and Hegel are complementary. But my question is first of all about the general concept by Umberto Eco of encyclopedia. Because if you Claudio has said that encyclopedia is a system, but he has also said before that pragmatism says us that everything is a habit, every meanings is an habit. So we could say that, could we say that an encyclopedia is an habit, maybe? Or most clearly, I think that encyclopedia is an habit. We have to think about encyclopedia in a pragmatic, in a strictly and radical pragmatic and Peircean matter, and thought about encyclopedia as a principle of classification, I think. So, a sort of Kantian maxim of action. If not, we are all blocked, and we can go on, and we are all in our libraries, in our Borgian's infinite libraries, Babelian libraries. But I think that Peirce, and maybe Eco was inspired by Peirce, I think much probably. I think that we have to think about encyclopedia as a principle of classification, so in a pragmatic sense. The second question, and then I conclude, is about the fact that philosophy begins and sometimes ends, with not with knowledge, but before commencing by knowledge, Socrates, know what you are. Know yourself. Nietzsche said another thing, a contrary thing about in respect of Socrates. Diventa ciò che sei in Italian, became what you are. So from one part we have knowledge, from the other part we have being. I think that the real problem of semiotics is not only cognitive, all good for the Kantian point of view, but we have to think in a Peircean and Kantian way, but more than Kantian and Peircean, more than Kantian and Hegelian way, in a ontological semiotics that not exclude the cognition, the cognitive semiotics, but regards semiotics under the respect, saying in Peirce's word, of being. That is one of the first problems in the use of categories of Peirce, I see. Thank you.
Turn my microphone on. Can you hear me? Yes, because I have seen that. I don't think that it's a very complex question. Of course, I would not say that encyclopedia is a habit. Habit is a tendency to act under some circumstances in the same circumstances in the same way under the same circumstances in the future. So encyclopedia is the product in some way of the habits that are distributed in material culture, in our embodied interactions and all that. So I would not make them overlap in some way. The way I try to think this idea is in a Foucaultian way, in some way, because this idea of historical a priori, which is also an effect of the enaction in some way of the meaningful engagement between the organisms and the environment in some way. The ontological question, it depends. If we mean ontology in an anthropological way, let's say Descola, for instance, I'm with you on that, because this is very crucial in some way, because it's a way of working which is, to me, in any way different from the way Lambros is working or the way Daniel is working. They're perfectly compatible between them. I think so. If with ontological semiotics you mean the idea that which is a dimension that you have in Peircean thought, in the thought by Peirce. Peirce is also a metaphysical thinker. So if you think that, for instance, if you take it's something that that as an activist we love, but the idea that there is a continuity between mind and matter for him is an ontological principle. It's a metaphysical principle, and cognition starts from this idea, these metaphysical ideas. So I would say, or if it does not start, it arrives in some way. There is still an ontology thought as a metaphysical principle inside Peirce. So I would not take that direction. So I would not think that what we can think in semiotics connected to cognition, knowledge, material agency, an action, as to bring us through an ontology of the world in some way, so through a metaphysical theory. It can do that. Someone of us maybe can want to go in this direction. I'm not one of these, one of them.
Okay, thank you, Claudio. Can you silence yourself when you're not talking?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, we have three more questions in the following order: Dan Hatto, Giuseppe Flavio Artese, and Juan Miranda. Please, Dan, come forward.
Hi, Claudio. Thank you for that. Even at 4 a.m., that's a challenging paper. Maybe even more so at 4 a.m. Okay, so makes me even more sorry to have missed Kathy Legg's presentation last week, because I got some sense of it, but not the whole thing. So I guess my first response to this was, I mean, look, this makes me interested a lot more in delving into the sense-making material than I have been before. I think when people have talked about it, it's been, in my view, quite a bit more murky. So I think bringing the habits into the story as the possibility for science. But let me also give you my first reaction, which is this. I suppose I wonder, so there's two things. If we technically, as you did, dissociate some of the standard, as you put it well, the analytics ways of thinking about what meaning is meant to be. So if we're very careful with that notion, and that would need careful articulation, then we can make the move to see whether we think that habits can be the basis of meaning or an instance of meaning, better put it that way, I'd say. Because what you're describing is that wherever you find a habit, you find some form of meaning, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. And I guess that's exciting for me as an analytic philosopher too, because I am a trained analytic philosopher, to think then, are there, naturally the counterfactual mills go, are there going to be instances where we have habits where we just don't want to even assign or say we find meaning in this other more technically described sense? There's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot to unpack there, because I think one of my worries, even when Varela first raised this, was he used language like interpretation. And, you know, you might think, although in a technical sense, you've got the Peircean 3-point arrangement, you just don't have something like interpretation on the part of the system, unless, of course, that notion itself is now clarified and reduced, right? So this is going to be the step every time. It's going to be clarifying and reducing that notion so that we don't have too much packed into it by association that we know that we can't deliver. So, I mean, I don't have obviously, technically, I think you're right. I think it's possible once we take away representation understood in terms of content. I mean, I'll give you a comparison in my own intellectual trajectory where this comes in, because I use Ruth Millikan's work all the time as a reference point. And Ruth, of course, used Peirce as a reference point. And Ruth, of course, for a long time, everyone thought was committed to representationalism, right? But she says blatantly, she says this in so many places. However, she draws out technical distinctions that are of great importance, and people were a bit surprised in the tradition to find that, because she'll say, whereas there is, you know, in her stories of intentional signs, there is intentionality in terms of directedness, there isn't anything like truth conditional content at that level. Well, rather, there is, she does, oh, sorry, let me correct that. She does think, and I think this is an odd notion, she thinks there can be truth conditional content, but there isn't anything like intentional with an S content. There's not Fregean content in that robust sense, which I'm not sure you can separate, okay? Now, the cool part about what you're doing is you're not saying there's truth conditional content. I think that was an important point. So you're saying there's engagement, but could there be forms of engagement that don't count as semiotic in a robust sense? So let me take you back. So I know it's long-winded. I want to set it up because there's a lot in it. Let me just take you back. I know it's 4 a.m. and I was getting coffee and still waking up. And I wanted to know, did you say at the beginning that you really don't find a semiotic system unless, or rather a mark of a semiotic system is that we have real deception? Is that right?
We don't need to factually have it, but the system has to afford for, so as to allow the construction of a significant surface in some way that can be used in order to lie, like the mating signal for the fireflies.
Can be used in order to lie. So that's going to be significant because, I mean, this is like one of the, so this is the point. What will be the mark of a, I mean, because in a way, technically you're going to win this if you can just say, by definition, anything that operates that is the, you know, can potentially be used, that's going to be ripe for using in semiotic systems where there can be something like deception. The animal kingdom is rife with that, but that don't fall into the category of something like being able to lie. That would be too much, I think. And the literature is all around that. So you get systems that certainly have that dynamic feature, but it won't be that it's meaningful in a sense to the system, right? It's meaningful for the system or something like that. But you won't be able to, I think, in every case, think of all the dynamic habits that we have. So I guess what I'm going to push on is, if we strip away, because we know it's kind of like knowing what it's not. We know what all the features, once we strip them out, that are standardly associated with meaning, what we've got is either just definitionally or technically going to be a form of sense making. So sense making, I've had this discussion with Ezekiel De Paolo a lot, which always comes up with the idea that, well, I'm happy with sense making, but if you're just telling me it's the precarious interactions with the environment, then that's going to just be what you get from a living system, because that's, of course, an adaptive, attuned response. Everyone can agree. If the meaning of meaning here just becomes whatever that picks out, you're going to be safe with your account. If, however, the meaning of meaning embeds some other features, then we can test to see whether or not they always go together. So I guess that's my kind of plea to you is can we clarify in positive terms, other than just repeating what the technical definition is for a habit or a living system? What is it? What is the notion of meaning once we strip it away from those other standard associations? So that's not a defeating argument. I think this is an interesting idea, but the question is, can that be done? So that's my question to you at 4 a.m. from Australia.
Then, yeah, it looks like you're very well.
Please, Claudio.
You're very well woken up. No, I don't know if I have an answer on that. Maybe I have to think about it and an answer in a future paper in some way. I think I've done something on that in the 3rd chapter of the book. So this is a kind of, I'm saying, of course, we have, in Italy, we have the semioticians and the philosophy of language. So we both share some kind of, there are analytical philosopher who works on Peirce. Fausto Caruana can tell you a lot more because he has a lot of discussions about a more pragmatist oriented way of interpreting Peirce and a more analytical way of doing the very same thing, which results of Millikan and myself in some way. And Umberto used to also, Eco used to also be inspired by Peirce and using pragmatism in order to build semiotics. And as you know very well, analytical philosophers do not like semiotics at all. Do not like the way we think about meaning. They do not like, because they think that meaning is connected to truth conditions and all that. And they do not like our way of thinking phenomena that they would put into pragmatics, into semantics. One of the core business idea of semiotics is that you cannot separate semantics from pragmatics. And why? Because we don't think of meaning, semantics, as concept connected to truth condition. So if you don't think meaning like that, you don't have the problem in some way. So because you don't have even the separation. So for me, it's a kind of very well-established tradition in Europe and in Italy, especially because it's the Umberto Eco tradition when I grew up and all that. The main ideas to me, what you were telling, I don't know if it's an answer, but maybe it's a kind of raise the question, re-raise the question, is the idea of representation. My impression is that the idea of representation connected with all the properties that representation has to have. If you take Sean's papers, he works a lot in his debate and all that. These conditions, these ideas come from the idea of sign. So they are kind of borrowing the idea of the properties of the external sign, which is something that we have no problems because we have it everywhere in the world, and they think that the property of the external sign are the properties of the internal representation. So they are in some way misled by this. It's a kind of an argumentation close to the one Lambros uses in How Things Shapes the Mind. So of the idea of external. they're kind of misleading a semiotic theory of meaning, and they borrow it and they translate it into the apparatus of analytic philosophy, and then it turns to be an internal representation. But these are the properties of the external science, and not the properties of the internal representation. So this would be what I would answer on that, in order to re-raise the question in some way, and thinking that my tradition, the semiotic tradition, can in some way help to solve a little bit all the problems, and you solve it in a perfect way. You say, we do not even use this terminology because it brings confusion. So it just stop thinking about sense, meaning, and all that, because this is semantics, this is interpretation, this is language. We do not want to mess with that. Okay, but my idea is that if you think that in a semiotic way, maybe you can still have the chance to build up something together. Luigi,
you have Claudio.
Dan wants to say something, so you have to enable him.
We want to reply.
Yeah, just a very quick comment back. I mean, I think that's exactly why I found the talk exciting, right? I think that you've divorced it from, as I understood what you were doing, all of those issues about the external sign and all of the, and that's very much in the spirit of radical enactivism too, right? We make a separation between this with all those properties and its issues and something else, which is what I was expecting in the original notions of sense making, but I have yet to see that developed, right? So when people, and so we are very critical, you're right, of sense making, because at least in the original outings, we're talking about, at least in the early versions, a few sentences here and there, a few gestures, a few comments, but it has not been, as far as I've been able to find, worked out in any detail of what the parameters are and what makes that way of, if you want to talk about meaning at that level rather than representation, what actually makes it meaningful, right? So I think the project is good. I'm sure it will have challenges, but I want to try to get a handle on the positive account of this alternative way of thinking so that I know where its boundaries might be, so I can do my usual analytic philosopher testing. That's just what I do. But good answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you.
Okay, now we have, oh, hi, Sean.
Hi, Sean.
Now. We have a question from Giuseppe Flavio Artese, please.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Thanks a lot for your talk. It was actually really interesting, and mine is more like a general question, so I will try to be quick. I was wondering if you can tell a few words about the relation between semiotics, the way you sketched it, and the teleological and Unasian aspect of enactivism, because recently I stumbled across another philosopher that is trying to make the same combination, Paulo de Jesus, and he thinks that this will lead to somehow to an activist to give up on the notion of teleology in general. And I was wondering, what do you think? And if you also share this intuition. That's it.
This is a really cool question. I think it's a kind of core business of what we are trying to build with the center, because teleology can also be, so if you take it in Kantian term, can also be interpreted is the way as if in some way, and this leads you to a lot of, for instance, the Vittorio works of the simulation and all this kind of stuff. So I don't know. I have to say that I've never read what the word you're talking about. So this is my limitation. So I apologize for that. So I cannot answer in details in that because I really never read it. So I simply thank you for the suggestion in some way, but I cannot give you a proper answer because I've never read it. So sorry for that.
Thank you. Now, Roman Esqueda, please.
I can't hear. I think you have to turn your microphone on.
Yeah, already.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the talk, Claudio. I've been waiting for your book for quite a long time since I had the announcement in Amazon, so it's still not coming yet. But what I would like to comment, more than a question, is a comment, is that I've been working on cognitive semiotics for quite a while, not knowing perhaps before that it was called cognitive semiotics, but I was very inspired by Vittorio Galese's work and the discovery of mirror neurons. And I think what he calls motor potentiality, when we talk about cognitive semiotics and acting and action, or when we talk about pairs and habit as action producing, action making, I think we have quite a very interesting field there for semiotics. But I don't know if our traditional concept of that comes from linguistics, like meaning itself, as you were discussing with Horo now, meaning making, enunciation, and all of these traditional concepts can fit very well with what cognitive science or neuroscience have found about acting. For example, Galese talks about motor potentiality, or Clark's definition of extended mind. I think we have a very, very interesting field of research there, not from the linguistic traditional concepts that we have. It's very challenging for us to work with other areas that are not within linguistics. For example, motor potentiality. If we're going to talk about acting, we need to talk about motor potentiality. And what I have been working on is I work on graphic design, on industrial design and architecture, and Vittorio Galese has done something on architecture and cinema and all of this. And I think this is very, very interesting because it opens another way to go to, I don't know if we can still call it meaning, but this kind of experience of acting through design, because design is very interesting. What I argue is that design has the word sign in it. And it has a lot to do with experience that mirror neurons discovery had with acting with things, you know. So design is a semiotic production. It has not been theorized as it should be. But, you know, when we talk about interaction and material culture and motor potentiality, design opens a field of research, which is very interesting. And I'm not sure if our traditional semiotic concepts, especially those taken from linguistics, can help us doing that. What do you think about that? Thank you very much.
So I totally agree on the first part. The aim of the book was exactly to try you know, think about all these new stuff that used to challenge semiotics, the work of Vittorio, the work of Dan, the work of Sean, the work of Lambert. So the idea was what semiotics can, if semiotics can say something about it. So and to me, so I totally agree on this idea and pragmatism, but also Lambros was, I think, the first one to, you know, work on this kind of topics and think that if you read How Things Shape the Mind, Lambros tells that what he's trying to do is a material semiotics in some way. So it's a kind of semiotics he was trying to, and discussing exactly all this kind of tradition. But Lambros is here, maybe we'll tell something later. My idea on the second part of the question is we have a semiotic idea, which is exactly the topic of my talk of today. We have a perfectly semiotic idea of action, which is the act of enunciation, which is exactly the one connected with the design, with the other, which is exactly what I talk about today. One of the idea is in the old semiotics, the Saussurean one, the Benveniste one, the act of enunciation was the act that made you pass from the shared dimension of language, the social dimension of language, to the individual act of appropriation of this kind of norms, habits, systems, and all that. We can build something more complex now, and this is what I was trying to do. We can think about this idea of act, of a semiotic act of enunciation, keeping together the work by Lambros, the work by Sean, the work by Vittorio, by Dan, and trying to, work on the semiotic production also of the design, because the design is a production of enunciates. It's a kind of an act of enunciation, thinking that through a new point of view, through a new 2021 semiotic theory in some way, that keeps together some of the exciting work done in these last 15 years in some way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Juan Miranda, please.
Hello. It was very interesting, also in complementing the previous talk by Kathy Lake, this emphasis on habits. And I liked this image of Eco saying, painting is not painting on a white surface and drawing things. It is actually cleaning the canvas. And this, I would say, if we use a little bit of a Hegelian term, it's like saying it's a negative definition of creation, right? And the analogy is even more clear when we think of Michelangelo and the David, carving away the stone that we don't need in order to create. But for example, if we think through Hegel a little bit, he will tell us that there are sometimes, like, from a given state or a given system, you cannot foresee what will come next. You have these radical creative revolutions, and we see this, for example, in science from Newton to Einstein, right? Or we can even see it in Michelangelo when he creates a statue when two other sculptors had tried to create with the same stone and they failed. The stone was almost spoiled, and he made the David out of it, right? So there is this sort of leap. And I wonder, how could we account for this leap for creation as such, starting from the premise of habits? How could we go there? That would be my question. Thank you.
Just a remark, because I'm for the participatory sense making and the sharing of the agency, but the idea of addition of subtraction, the idea of empty, is not by Eco, is by myself. So I have to say, you cannot find it there, but it's not important. The answer is always the same. It's the idea. Is the idea of act, of enunciation. So it's the only thing you can do. I've read a book of 400 pages, which is in Italian, but now it's going on. It's going out in French too. I don't know if French is exactly on this topic, because if you think, to me, the key is what in semiotics we call the modes of existence. If you take a semiotic form, this can at least have 4 different modes of existence. It can be virtual, it can be potential, it can be actualized, and it can be realized. Okay, so when you make an act of enunciation, and I want to something underline with force the idea of a material turn in semiotics. That does not mean that we have to take care of the substances, substance of expression, substance of is the idea that we have to take care and think the act of enunciation, the sense-making act. And the idea is that every sense-making act, if you think in a material engagement way, in some way, so is an act that turns a semiotic form from a previous mode of existence to another mode of existence. Something like an enunciate can be potentialized, can be virtualized, something that is virtual can be realized, can be actualized, and all that. So the act This is a kind of Latour's idea. Latour writes a book, it's called On the Modes of Existence, and it's connected to the act of enunciation. And he's thinking that the act of creativity, and all that, you have Michelangelo and all this kind of stuff, is a kind of act that makes you pass, it's a kind of passage from one mode of existence to another mode of existence. The idea my idea is that we have to keep together this Latourian idea of enunciation with the sense-making idea of act connected to what we have already taught. So I would go in that way in order to reply to your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't see other questions, so just waiting for more questions to pop up. I will take a chance and ask you one, Claudio. You were talking about semiotic niches. So I would like to ask you to which extent one particular semiotic niche we are dealing with as we speak, the digital one, may or may not, that's what I'm asking you, lead to a much sharper, less sharper distinction between which is it and which it is not. Quoting Eco, you were pointing out that one of the goal of cognitive semiotics is to provide account for both, for what we take to be out there, but also Red Riding Hood, or all the fictional characters. So once we bring in the digital niche, the digital semiotic niche, this contrast between what it is and what it is not is still on firm ground, or are we supposed to redefine what it is and what it is not? Thank you.
Idea of fiction. So to me, according to Umberto, it was even stronger in some way. Eco used to say that narrative universe are the universe that are connected to truth in some way, because because they are a kind of ersatz of the world. But in these narrative words, the truth is necessary. So this way he's telling narrative words learn us how to die, because you want to change the story. You want to change that character is not dying, but he dies, even if you do not want to. So this is a kind of it's the way to make you learn that things cannot be changed in any way that are exactly like that. So it was one of the things he was telling in the first quotation, that narrative universe are a kind of ersatz of the natural world. So the idea of semiotics is to think them together in some way, to think sharing a very same model. I worked a lot on that. Connected to the Persian idea of abduction, connected to the idea, for instance, that in the Zadig by Voltaire, or in the Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle, you have the author of the novel that makes the inference of the detective true every time, because there is a kind of strong syncretism, a strong continuity between the thought of the detective and the world in which he lives in. But in the real world, you do not have Arthur Conan Doyle that that grants that the inferences and the abductions that you do are always right and always correct in some way. But it's a good idea of, to me, it's a good idea, the semiotic, the Umberto Eco's idea of thinking them together and you know, of course, you have to tell the differences, but building a common model connected to abduction, to you know, to inquire in some way, in order to think about these kind of topics. The idea of semiotic niches is to me, you have one of them when in some way you find different forms of regulation of the interactions in some way. So of course the digital domain changes the form of regulation of the interaction. So it's obviously a kind of a semiotic niche in some way, because it's a domain where things are done in a different way, in some way, if compared to other kind of semiotics domains. So I would say yes, the digital domain is a kind of different way of regulating the interaction in the social practice in some way. So, and the digital world is a kind of domain that have pruned possibilities in some way and has built ecologically a semiotic environment in some way in which we live in this kind of situation. So I would say yes.
Thank you. More questions, comments? Lambros.
Thank you, Claudio. That was a very rich and excellent presentation. A lot to think about, and I look forward to reading your book also. I have just one comment by way of clarification that I would like to ask from you. I think that at some point, I'm not sure, I might be wrong on that, you made a distinction between the natural environment versus the semiotic environment, if I understand you correctly. And my question is what exactly you mean by that, and whether you are implying that there is some kind of different semiotic relationship when it comes to our engagement with the natural environment rather than the artificial environment. Perhaps I misunderstood something of what you said, but I'm curious if you could clarify that. That's my main question. I was wondering also as a second part of the question, since it was also raised before. I really enjoyed your example of the canvas and the painter, and there are a lot of things that one could think about and do with that example. But it was not clear to me why you have used that example in the context of your argument. I mean, what exactly you're trying to illustrate with that? There are, as I said, a lot that we can think about by means of the canvas, especially the way you have presented and you have interpreted this experience. But I'm curious of why you have chosen this, if you could give us some more specific reasons for that. Thanks.
Thank you, Lambros. The first one is, it was said in order to not make this kind of difference. So to think the natural environment, which does not exist, in my opinion, together with the semiotic environment. To me, the environment is always semiotic. But you may know that, for instance, Eco, in A Theory of Semiotics, makes a very clear distinction that to me is not a good one at all, telling that semiotics, deals only with cultural established relations. To me, this is not the case at all, because it's an idea that relegates semiotics into the cultural domain. So and this has been very, very popular in my tradition. So it's the reasons of the culture against the reasons of nature in some way. And this is exactly what I do not want to do. I think it's the enemy in some way. It's the idea of thinking together cultural environment and natural environment under the aegis of a semiotic environment in some way, which distributed agency, multiple instances of acting and of enunciating. Why the example of the adding or subtraction? What I wanted to do with that? I wanted to do two things. The first one is to connect with Di Paolo's idea of sense-making. In linguistic bodies, Di Paolo, Cuffari, and Jäger, they work on the idea that sense-making is not an adding of an individual, the adding of an individual meaning to others' individual meaning, but it's a kind of subtracting, building a niche from the multiple possible relationship between the organism and the environment. Okay, so this was one of the first aim of the example. The other one was in some way to throw away this idea that you have a subject that makes a categorization of the environment in some way. So it's a kind of Kantian phenomenological way of thinking that you have a kind of consciousness or subject thinking the way you want to think, that cuts a kind of environment, turning, building categories. It's kind of old Kantian way. The idea was that you have a good semiotic way of thinking this kind of sense-making activities if you think that meaning is the result, is emergent in some way from the system. So the example was chosen in order to make a theory of system semiotics connected to a distributed agency. So it's not the subject that builds its own categorization inside an environment. Don't know if it is more clear now, or if I have an answer to.
Thanks, Claudio.
Okay, Aldo Gangemi, please.
Hello, Claudio. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Nice to meet you. Very interesting, actually. I don't know how much of the community knows me, but I am from University of Bologna and from National Research Council and direct the Institute for Cognitive Sciences. I talk here as a past semiotician, but since 20 years I've been working with computer scientists, and I work in artificial intelligence especially. Then it comes naturally to me to think about your proposal, or at least your examples of subtracting with respect to Eco's encyclopedia as a natural way of imagining what is happening, actually has been happening in artificial intelligence since a long time, both in knowledge-based symbolic systems that try to schematize what our knowledge so that it could be tractable in computational terms. And on the other hand, what is happening now with deep learning, where actually features allow to discover patterns that simplify a lot and possibly over-bias sometimes our knowledge so that it can perform certain simplification and then certain tasks. The point is that you might wonder why I'm talking about that, since we are discussing about here cognitive semiotics, a term that I appreciate a lot and I tried actually to pursue in my work. But consider that artificial intelligence is going to add something to our techno-social society, and this is happening already. And this kind of changes the way we deal with semantic phenomena. So I'm just wondering if you, as a community, actually, cognitive semioticians, not only you as Claudio, thought about how you could help improving the situation in the foundations of artificial intelligence, for example, so contributing ways of mediating between extremely situated and embodied approaches on one hand, and more traditional propositional accounts of knowledge that actually allow, for example, nowadays to to provide new ways for explaining the results of AI, which is a major problem at the moment we are dealing with. So I wanted just to throw this another aspect to the picture, to the discussion. Thank you, by the way, very inspiring.
Thank you very much, Aldo. I think you got an important point, totally important point. I would also add that Eco to me was very inspired by what thinking the idea of encyclopedia, what was happening inside artificial intelligence and all that. So I think that also some of the metaphors he uses and the concept, not only the metaphors, comes from this kind of knowledge that it knew very well. He was the first one to, I don't know if you know it, but Eco obliged the students of philosophy in the 80s to have computer science classes in the 80s. So it was really pioneering in some way, because it was. Of course, the answer is yes, but I come to that later. I just wanted to make a little bit of an historical, in some way, excursus, because it can lead to why I talk much more on this kind of stuff. Cognitive sciences, we know very well. The model was the computer, in some way, was the Turing machine. The revolution of enactivism was the idea that, okay, for cognition is not artificial intelligence anymore, the model, but it's the living body, in some ways, the living organism. Okay, that's why I started from there. Okay, because it's a crucial revolution for enactivism, and I try to. But if we take this idea of semiotic environment and material engagement, for instance, maybe we can a little bit think about again of this kind of opposition. If I'm right, I don't know if I am, but if I'm right to say that if you have a semiotic system, if that systems allows for building deception in some way, I think that this definition can work perfectly fine also for artificial systems and explain a lot of mediation that technologies and all the work you're doing as an informatician is applying us to our perception of the digital environment, and not only the digital environment, the real world that is mediated, but all these kind of digital instances that in some way represents the background of our perception of the world in some way. Coming to the role of semiotics, this kind of mediation of technologies, I think that one of the main topic of also the main contribution that semiotics can give in this kind of work is exactly a semantic representation, because many of the ontologies of the work that is done inside artificial intelligence, I think, is highly inspired by a truth conditional semantics or a propositional semantics that comes from the analytical philosophy. All the works on the ontologies, the difference between semantics and pragmatics are at work in some way. You know very well, you worked a lot with Tullio De Mauro, so Umberto and De Mauro were friends, and so they worked a lot on this. I think that maybe semiotics can help to implement a different model of meaning and instruct machine starting from a different model of meaning. That can be something interesting to try. So, I don't know if it was a proper answer.
Yeah, thanks, Claudio. This is exactly what is happening now. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think I have to.
Okay, thank you. More questions? We still have about 10 minutes. Sean.
Sean.
Yeah, so, yeah, hi. I don't have a question because I came very late, and I just wanted to apologize for missing your lecture. It sounds like it was great. I have read your book though, so that makes up for it, I think. But I was at a PhD defense, and I just could not get out of that. Anyway, I've joined late, and I'm here for the questions, and I'm still listening. So.
Thank you, Sean. But I knew that because you wrote me, so I know that you had this defense for the PhD student. But you read all the books, so it was nothing new for you. A little bit at the end, something new, not so much.
Okay.
I don't see any raised hands.
I think we can say thank you to everybody.
Well, it has been really inspiring, thought-provoking, and I think, as Dan said, there's a lot of work to do, but I think work that definitely is going to pay back a lot, I assume. And so I'm very excited about everything that's going on at the center. And I saw a picture of Dan on the beach. I wasn't sure whether it was taken these days with Millikan. Is she visiting you?
That was from 2 years ago when.
Okay.
But she's active. She's out there in lots of reading groups. One of my PhD students, Ian, has been sitting in, so she's still around. You can't escape her.
Yeah. I call her the Iron Lady.
I have a much more updated picture, a picture of Dan playing Dungeons and Dragons
with Max.
With his friend.
Yeah. Okay, so if there are no further comments, thank you everybody for being here, and great thanks to our speaker Claudio Paolucci for this very exciting talk, and more exciting talk to come in the coming weeks. So up with the center, and see you.
We can say that in 3 weeks we will have Lambros and Maria Dane Cucuti, they will talk about mirror gazing. So Lambros is the next, then we will have Dan, later Vittorio, and Fausto. They all talk, both Vittorio and Fausto will talk about habits, so I think we will have many chances to come back on the topics we touched a little bit today. So it's a long way to go.
Okay, bye everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye.